The cafe was packed, as it always was on open mic Thursdays. Warm yellow lights hung low over mismatched wooden tables, casting soft shadows on the brick walls lined with local art and chalkboard menus. The air smelled like roasted coffee beans, cinnamon, and the faint tang of spilled beer from the night before. Laughter bubbled up from clusters of college students hunched over laptops or sharing plates of fries. A few regulars sat near the back, nursing mugs of tea and watching the stage with half-hearted interest. Most folks came for the free Wi-Fi or the cheap lattes, but a few, just a few, actually showed up for the performers. The host, a lanky guy with a scruffy beard and a voice that always sounded like he'd just woken up, stepped onto the small platform at the front of the room. He tapped the microphone, causing a sharp squeal of feedback that made several people wince. All right, he said, flashing a tired grin. Next up, He squinted at the crumpled slip of paper in his hand. Eleanor, a pause. No one moved, Eleanor. He called again, louder this time, scanning the crowd. From a corner table near the restrooms, a woman slowly rose. She was older, much older than anyone else in the room. Her silver hair was pulled back in a loose bun, strands escaping like frayed threads. She wore a faded floral dress that might have been stylish 40 years ago, paired with a thin cardigan buttoned unevenly. On her feet were two different shoes, one brown loafer, one black flat, and she leaned heavily on a wooden cane with a rubber tip worn smooth from use. A few people turned to look. Then a few more. Whispers started like ripples in still water. Is that her? Seriously? She's performing. She must be lost. Someone near the front let out a short, nervous laugh. It wasn't mean-spirited, not exactly, but it carried the kind of awkward amusement people show when they don't know how to react to something unexpected. That laugh sparked another, then another, until a low wave of chuckles rolled through the room. Not cruel, but careless. The kind of laughter that comes from surprise, not malice, but still cuts deep if you're on the receiving end. The woman didn't flinch. She just kept walking, step by careful step, her cane tapping softly against the hardwood floor. Each movement seemed to take effort, as if her bones ached with every shift of weight. But her back was straight, her chin slightly raised. She reached the stage and paused, gripping the edge with one hand while the host hurried over to help. "You sure you want to do this?" he asked quietly, his voice low enough that only she could hear. He glanced back at the audience, already sensing the mood. She nodded once. Yes. He hesitated, then stepped aside, giving her space. She climbed the single step onto the platform with visible strain, then shuffled toward the microphone stand. It was set too high for her, so she reached up with both hands, cane tucked under one arm, and tried to lower it. Her fingers trembled. The metal stand wobbled. A few more nervous giggles rose from the crowd, but then she stopped trying to adjust it. Instead, she leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the small wooden stool beside the mic. She took a slow breath. Another. Her eyes, pale blue and sharp behind thin-rimmed glasses, scanned the room, not with fear, but with something quieter. Resolve, maybe. Or memory. The host gave her a nod and stepped back into the shadows near the soundboard. The room quieted slightly, though the tension remained. People weren't sure whether to keep laughing, look away, or pay attention. Most chose to watch, if only out of curiosity. She cleared her throat. The sound was dry, fragile, like old paper being unfolded. Then she spoke, her voice softer than expected, but clear. "I'd like to sing a song," she said. "One my husband wrote for me. The night before he passed." The words landed like stones in still water. The laughter stopped. Completely. Even the clinking of cups ceased. A couple who'd been whispering about their weekend plans fell silent. The barista behind the counter paused mid-pour, coffee dripping unnoticed onto the counter. Someone in the back slowly lowered their phone. Because suddenly this wasn't funny anymore. This was real. She didn't introduce herself, didn't explain why she was there or how she'd signed up. She just stood there, small and steady in her mismatched shoes, holding onto that stool like it was the only thing keeping her upright. And maybe it was, not just physically but emotionally. Because what she'd just said changed everything. People began to see her differently. Not as an oddity, not as a mistake, but as someone carrying something heavy. A grief so deep it had probably shaped every day of her life for years. And now here she was, choosing to share a piece of it in a room full of strangers who'd just laughed at her. She reached into the pocket of her cardigan and pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed at the edges. With careful fingers, she opened it and smoothed it against the stool. The handwriting was neat, slanted slightly to the right. Someone's careful script, preserved like a treasure. She glanced at the lyrics once, then looked up, her gaze settling somewhere beyond the back wall, as if she could see through the bricks and into another time, another place. A small smile touched her lips, brief, tender, gone almost as soon as it appeared. Then she began to sing. Her voice was thin at first, wavering like a candle flame in a draft. But there was warmth in it, a depth that surprised everyone. It wasn't trained or polished, it was human. Raw. Honest. She sang about paper wings and rainy Tuesdays, about dancing in the kitchen at midnight, about promises whispered in hospital rooms. The song wasn't famous. It wasn't even particularly complex. But it was full of love. So much love it felt like the room couldn't hold it all. And as she sang, something shifted. The man who'd laughed first now stared at his coffee, his shoulders hunched. A young woman near the window wiped her eyes quickly, pretending to adjust her glasses. An older couple in the corner reached for each other's hands without a word. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the street noise outside, the honking cars, the distant sirens seemed to fade into the background, as if the whole city had paused to listen. Because in that moment, she wasn't just an old woman on a stage. She was every person who'd ever loved and lost, every widow who'd woken up alone for the first time in decades, every heart that had kept beating even when it felt like it shouldn't. And the audience? They weren't just spectators anymore. They were witnesses. By the time she reached the second verse, her voice had grown stronger, steadier, as if the act of singing was giving her back some of what she'd lost. Or maybe just reminding her that it was still there, inside her, in the music, in the memory. She never looked at the crowd. Her eyes stayed fixed on that invisible point in the distance, as if her husband were standing there, listening, smiling, waiting. And maybe in her heart, he was. The song wasn't long, just 3 minutes, maybe less. But those 3 minutes stretched and deepened, filling the room with something words couldn't quite capture. It wasn't sadness exactly. It was more like recognition, like being seen. When she finished the last line, "And I'll carry you in every breath I take," she let the final note hang in the air, soft and trembling. Then silence. Not the awkward silence from before. Not the silence of judgment or discomfort. This was a different kind of quiet. Heavy. Sacred. She lowered her head for just a second, her shoulders rising and falling with a deep breath. Then she folded the paper carefully, tucked it back into her pocket, and straightened up. She didn't bow. Didn't smile for applause. She just turned, picked up her cane, and began the slow walk back down from the stage. But before she'd taken 2 steps, someone in the back stood up, then another, until the whole room was on its feet. No one shouted. No one whistled. They just stood, quietly, respectfully, as she made her way back to her corner table. Some people had tears on their cheeks. Others simply looked stunned, as if they'd just woken from a dream. She sat down, placed her cane against the chair, and wrapped her hands around a teacup that had long gone cold. She didn't look around, didn't seek praise. She just sat there, eyes closed for a moment, as if gathering herself, because what she'd done hadn't been for them, it had been for him, and maybe, just maybe for herself, but the room would never be the same. Not after that. Later people would talk about it for weeks. "Did you see that woman?" I cried like a baby. I didn't even know her, but I felt like I knew her whole life. The host would replay the moment in his head 100 times, wondering if he should have introduced her better, if he should have warned the crowd. But in the end, none of that mattered. Because sometimes the most powerful moments happen when no one expects them, when someone steps into a space not built for them and says simply, "This is my truth," and the world, if it's listening, stops to hear it. That night, the cafe closed later than usual. People lingered, talking in hushed tones, sharing stories of their own grandparents, parents, loves lost too soon. The usual Thursday crowd had come for entertainment, but they left with something far more valuable. A reminder that dignity doesn't fade with age, that courage often wears quiet clothes, and that sometimes the most beautiful music comes from the most unexpected voices. and as the last customer stepped out into the cool night air, the host turned off the lights, leaving only the glow of the street lamp outside. On the small stage, the microphone stood silent, but the echo of her song lingered, in the walls, in the floorboards, in the hearts of everyone who'd been there. Because once you've heard a truth sung with that kind of love, you never really forget it. Life hadn't always been quiet for her. There was a time, long before the cane, before the empty chair at the kitchen table, before the silence that settled into the house like dust, when music filled every room. Not the kind that blared from speakers or played on the radio, but the kind that lived in the walls, in the creak of floorboards, in the rhythm of two people moving through their days together. She'd worked as a school librarian for over 30 years. Not the kind of job that made headlines, but the kind that mattered in ways people rarely noticed. She remembered every child who walked through those library doors, the shy ones who hid behind bookshelves, the loud ones who needed a quiet corner to calm down, the dreamers who checked out the same fantasy series 3 times a summer. She never raised her voice, never scolded. She just listened, offered a book, and somehow that was enough. Kids left her library feeling seen. That was her gift. At home, it was different. At home, she wasn't the calm librarian. She was the woman who danced barefoot in the kitchen while chopping onions, humming along to jazz records spinning on an old turntable. Her husband, the one who wrote the song, was the one behind the piano. He never made it big, never played in fancy concert halls or had his name on album covers, but he played like every note mattered. Like every chord was a promise. They met in college, both studying literature, though he dropped out after a year to chase music. She stayed, finished her degree, and became the steady one, the planner, the saver, the one who balanced the checkbook while he scribbled lyrics on napkins. People sometimes assumed she'd resented that, but she never did. She loved his wild heart, his messy hair, the way he'd forget to eat if he was lost in a melody, and he loved her quiet strength, her patience, the way she could calm a storm with just a look. They built a life in a small house with peeling paint and a garden that never quite bloomed the way she wanted. But it was theirs. Every cracked tile in the bathroom, every creaky step on the staircase, they knew it all by heart. Weekends were for pancakes, crossword puzzles, and long walks where they'd talk about nothing and everything. Evenings were for tea, records, and sometimes just sitting in silence, hands intertwined on the couch. Then came the illness. It started small. Just a cough that wouldn't go away, a tiredness that sleep couldn't fix. Doctors ran tests. Then more tests. The words rare, aggressive, and not much time were spoken gently, but they landed like hammers. She didn't cry in the office. She waited until they were back in the car, engine off, rain tapping on the windshield. That's when she let go, great heaving sobs that shook her whole body. He held her, his own tears mixing with hers, and whispered, "I'm not leaving you yet." And he didn't. Not right away. For months, he fought. She became his nurse, his cook, his advocate. She learned to give injections, track medications, read medical reports like novels. But she also made sure there was still music. Even when he was too weak to sit at the piano, she'd play his old recordings. And sometimes, on good days, he'd hum new melodies from his hospital bed, asking her to write them down. The night before he died, he was lucid, clear-eyed, calm. They were alone in the hospital room, the only light coming from the street lamp outside. He asked for paper and a pen. His hands shook, but he wrote slowly, carefully. When he was done, he handed her the page. "This is for you," he said. "Sing it when you're ready." She didn't read it that night. She tucked it into her purse and held his hand until his breathing slowed, then stopped. She sat there for hours after, not moving, just watching his face as if waiting for him to open his eyes and say it was all a mistake. The days that followed were a blur of arrangements. Phone calls, black clothes, and casseroles from neighbors who didn't know what else to do. She thanked everyone politely, accepted hugs she didn't feel, and came home to a house that felt too big and too empty all at once. For months, she barely left the house. The garden grew wild. Mail piled up on the counter. She stopped answering the phone. Grief wasn't just sadness, it was exhaustion. It was waking up and forgetting for a split second that he was gone. It was reaching for his hand in the dark and finding only cold sheets. It was hearing a song on the radio and having to pull over because she couldn't see through her tears. Her granddaughter, the one with bright eyes and endless questions, was the first to break through. She started visiting every Sunday, bringing groceries, laundry detergent, and stubborn optimism. At first, she just sat with her, not saying much. Then she began asking about the old days. Tell me about when you two met. What was his favorite song? Did he ever write you love letters? Slowly, the stories came back. Not as wounds, but as treasures. And with them, something else returned. A flicker of herself. One afternoon, the granddaughter mentioned a community center down the street that had started a choir for older adults. Just singing old songs, nothing fancy, she said casually, as if it were no big deal. They meet Tuesday mornings. Coffee's free. She almost said no. The idea of leaving the house, of being around people, of singing, when she hadn't even hummed in years, felt impossible. But then she remembered the piece of paper in her nightstand drawer. The song he'd written for her. And she thought, maybe I'm ready. The first choir rehearsal was terrifying. She stood outside the community center for 10 minutes, gripping her cane, heart pounding. Inside, a dozen or so people, mostly women, a few men, were chatting and laughing like old friends. She felt like an intruder, but the choir director, a warm woman with silver braids and a voice like honey, spotted her right away. You must be new, she said, walking over. Come on in. We're just warming up. She sat in the back, barely opening her mouth at first. But as the group sang Moon River and What a Wonderful World, something loosened in her chest. It wasn't perfect. Her voice cracked. She missed a few notes. But no one cared. No one judged. They just sang, week after week, she returned. She started arriving early to help set up chairs. She brought homemade cookies once, and everyone raved about them. She even laughed, real laughter, for the first time in years. It felt strange in her throat, like a muscle she'd forgotten how to use. Still, she never sang the song he'd written. Not yet. She'd take the paper out sometimes, read the lyrics, trace the letters with her finger. But singing it felt too big, too final. Like once she sang it, she'd have to fully accept that he was gone. And she wasn't sure she could bear that. Then came the flyer. It was taped to the community center bulletin board. Open mic night, all ages welcome, share your talent. Below it, a list of past performers. Poets, guitar players, a guy who did magic tricks with playing cards. At the bottom, in smaller print, sign-up sheet on the front desk. Her granddaughter saw it the same day. You should do it, she said immediately. No, she replied too quickly. Why not? You've been singing every week. You're good. It's not the same. That's a cafe full of strangers, young people. They won't want to hear an old woman sing. They don't know that yet, her granddaughter said with a grin. Besides, you're not just any old woman. You've got a story. She didn't sign up that day, or the next, but the idea stuck in her mind like a burr. She dreamed about it, standing on a stage, microphone in hand, the song trembling on her lips. In the dream, sometimes the crowd walked out. Sometimes they clapped. Once they cried. A week before the open mic, she found herself standing in front of the sign-up sheet. Her hand shook as she wrote her name. Just Eleanor, no last name. No explanation. She tucked the pen back and walked away before she could change her mind. The days leading up to the performance were a mix of dread and something else. Anticipation, maybe. She practiced the song in the shower, in the garden, in the quiet of her bedroom with the door closed. She memorized every word, every pause, every breath. She even bought new shoes, though in her rush she grabbed 2 different pairs from the closet and didn't notice until she was already at the cafe. She didn't tell anyone she was going. Not the choir, not her neighbors. Only her granddaughter knew, and she promised not to show up. I don't want you nervous because I'm watching, she said. This is for you. So when she walked into the cafe that Thursday evening, she was alone. She ordered a cup of tea, found a table in the back, and watched the performers come and go. A young man with a guitar sang about heartbreak. A poet read verses about city lights. A teenager did a surprisingly good impression of a famous comedian. The crowd clapped, laughed, snapped their fingers. It felt alive, vibrant, nothing like the quiet world she'd been living in, and then her name was called. She stood up. Her legs felt like jelly. Her palms were sweaty. For a moment she thought about turning around and walking out, but then she touched the pocket of her cardigan, felt the folded paper inside, and remembered his voice. Sing it when you're ready. Maybe she wasn't ready, but she was going to try. And that's how she found herself on that small stage, facing a room full of strangers who didn't know her story, who didn't know about the decades of love, the quiet sacrifices, The nights spent holding a dying man's hand, the years of silence that followed. All they saw was an old woman in mismatched shoes. But what they heard, that was something else entirely. Because the song wasn't just notes and words, it was a lifetime. It was every morning he made her coffee just the way she liked it. It was every time he held her when she cried over a book. It was the way he looked at her, like she was the only person in the world, right up until his last breath. And now, she was giving that to them. Not for fame, not for praise, but because love like that shouldn't stay hidden. It should be shared, even if it hurts. Especially if it hurts. She didn't know it yet, but that night would change more than just her. It would ripple outward, touching people she'd never meet, reminding them of their own lost loves, their own quiet heroes, their own reasons to keep going. But for now, in that moment, it was just her and the song, and that was enough. The first note left her lips like a breath held too long, finally released. It wasn't loud. It wasn't showy. It was just there, a single thread of sound, thin but true, weaving through the hushed air of the cafe. And in that instant something shifted, not just in the room but in time itself. The clatter of dishes from the kitchen faded. The low hum of the refrigerator quieted. Even the street outside seemed to hold its breath. She stood with her hands resting lightly on the stool, eyes closed now, as if the lyrics weren't on the paper in her pocket anymore but etched into her bones. The song began simply. You folded your coat by the door like always. Her voice wavered on always, just slightly like a leaf trembling in a breeze. But she didn't stop. She leaned into it, let the tremble become part of the music. People who had been slouched in their chairs straightened. A young man near the front who'd been scrolling through his phone just seconds before looked up. His thumb stopped moving. His expression changed, not to boredom, not to pity, but to something softer. Recognition, maybe. Like he'd heard this feeling before, even if he'd never heard these words. The second line came. Left your keys on the table, your coffee still warm. Her voice grew steadier now, warmed by memory. She wasn't singing to the crowd. She was singing to him, to the man who used to come home late from gigs at tiny bars, smelling of smoke and sweat and hope, who'd kiss her forehead before slipping into bed, to the man who saved every spare dollar for piano strings and sheet music, who never complained when dinner was beans again, because he'd spent their grocery money on a vintage record he just had to have. As she sang, the room began to dissolve around her. She wasn't in a cafe anymore. She was back in their kitchen, watching him stir sugar into his coffee with that absent-minded smile he got when a new melody was forming in his head. She could almost smell the burnt toast, hear the old radio crackling in the corner, feel the warmth of his hand brushing hers as they passed each other in the narrow hallway. And the audience? They weren't just listening. They were falling into her world. A woman near the window blinked rapidly, then turned her face toward the glass, pretending to watch the rain. A college student with headphones dangling around his neck sat very still, his usual smirk gone. Even the barista, who'd seen hundreds of open mic acts come and go, leaned against the counter with her arms crossed, eyes glistening. The song wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic declarations. It was about the small things, the kind most people forget. The way he always tucked the blanket around her shoulders when she fell asleep on the couch. The silly nicknames he made up for the neighbor's cat. The way he'd hum while fixing the leaky faucet, turning a chore into a private concert. You wrote me 1,000 songs no one else ever heard, she sang, her voice gaining strength now, filling the space like sunlight through a dusty window. But this one was just for me. That line hit like a quiet thunderclap. Because it was true. He'd written hundreds of songs over the years. Some hopeful, some sad, some full of jazz riffs and clever rhymes. But this one, the one he wrote the night before he died, was different. It didn't try to be clever. It didn't try to impress. It was just love, plain and raw, wrapped in melody. She opened her eyes then, not to look at the crowd but to look past them, to the back wall, where a faded poster of a jazz festival hung crookedly. And in that moment she saw him, not as he was at the end, thin, pale, tethered to tubes, but as he'd been in his prime. Tousled hair, crooked grin, fingers dancing over piano keys like they were alive. A tear slipped down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. She let it fall, let it be part of the song. The next verse began softer, almost a whisper. They say time heals, but I don't want it to. Her voice cracked on two, and this time she didn't fight it. She let the break happen, let the ache show, and that's when the first sniffle came from the audience, then another. Someone quietly blew their nose. No one was embarrassed. No one looked away because grief like this, it's universal. Everyone in that room had lost someone, a parent, a friend, a pet, a version of themselves they'd left behind. And hearing it sung so plainly, so honestly, unlocked something in them. Not pain exactly, but connection. The kind that says, you're not alone, I've been there too. The host, standing near the soundboard, had forgotten to check his phone. He just watched her, arms loose at his sides, his usual detached expression replaced by something like awe. He'd hosted hundreds of acts, comedians bombing jokes, singers off-key, poets reading about their cats. But this was different. This wasn't performance. This was offering. She reached the bridge of the song now, the emotional heart of it. If love could build a house, I'd live in yours forever. Her voice swelled, not with volume, but with feeling. It filled the room like smoke, soft and all-encompassing. People leaned forward in their seats. Shoulders touched. Hands found other hands, strangers holding on to each other without a word. A man in the back, who'd come in just for a quick coffee and stayed out of curiosity, covered his face with one hand. His shoulders shook silently. Beside him, his friend put a hand on his back and left it there. She didn't rush. She let each word breathe. She let the silences between lines speak as loudly as the notes. And in those silences, the room seemed to grow smaller, more intimate, as if the walls had moved closer, wrapping everyone in a shared moment of tenderness. Then came the final verse. The hardest one. The one she'd practiced 100 times in her bedroom, always stopping before the last line because it hurt too much. But tonight she didn't stop. So I'll keep your coat by the door, she sang, voice trembling but clear. Leave your coffee cup out. Pretend you're just running late. Her breath hitched. She paused just for a heartbeat. The room held that pause with her. No one moved. No one dared. Then, softly, almost like a secret, and I'll carry you in every breath I take. The last note hung in the air, fragile and perfect. Then silence, not the kind of silence that follows a bad joke or an awkward pause. This was a sacred silence, the kind that comes after something true has been spoken, the kind that says, we heard you, we see you, we feel it too. She lowered her head. Her hands, still resting on the stool, were shaking. She took a slow breath, then another, gathering herself. She didn't look up right away. She needed a moment, just one, to say goodbye to him again. Because singing that song was like visiting him, and leaving the stage was like walking away. But then she straightened. She folded her hands neatly in front of her, and she stepped back from the microphone. That's when it happened. A single pair of hands began to clap. Then another. Then another. Within seconds, the whole room was on its feet. Not cheering, not whistling, just clapping, slow, steady, respectful. Tears streamed down faces. People nodded at her, some mouthing, thank you, though she wasn't looking. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod in return, then turned and walked slowly back to her seat. Her cane tapped softly against the floor with each step. No one spoke. No one rushed to fill the space she'd left. They just let the moment linger, like the final chord of a symphony still vibrating in the air. When she reached her table, she sat down carefully, placing her cane against the chair. She wrapped her hands around her teacup again, though it was long cold. She didn't smile, didn't cry. She just sat there, eyes closed, breathing, because something had happened up there, something she hadn't expected. She'd gone up to honor him, to keep a promise. But in doing so, she'd given something to everyone else too. She'd reminded them that love doesn't end when someone dies. It changes shape. It lives in songs, in memories, in the way you still set a place at the table out of habit. A young woman approached her table a few minutes later, holding a fresh cup of tea. This is for you, she said softly, placing it down. My grandma passed last year. Thank you for singing that. She looked up, surprised. Then she nodded. You're welcome, she whispered. More people came by. Not to gush, not to take photos, but just to say a quiet word. That meant a lot. My dad used to play piano too. I'm going to call my mom tomorrow. Each one left her feeling less alone, not more exposed. The host came over too, crouching slightly so he wasn't towering over her. That was incredible, he said, his voice rough. I don't even know what to say. You don't have to say anything, she replied gently. Just thank you for letting me sing. He nodded, eyes bright, and walked away. The rest of the open mic night continued, but it felt different now. The next performer, a guy with a ukulele, started his song, then paused. I think I'll skip mine, he said. Nothing I've got feels right after that. The crowd murmured in understanding. No one minded. People stayed longer than usual that night. They talked in low voices, shared stories, lingered over empty cups. The usual Thursday energy, fast, distracted, self-absorbed, had been replaced by something slower, kinder. More human, and she stayed until the end. Not because she wanted attention, but because for the first time in years she didn't feel like an outsider. She felt like she belonged, not despite her age, her grief, her quiet life, but because of it. As she finally stood to leave, the host walked her to the door. Will you come back? He asked. She thought about it. Then she smiled, a real smile, small but warm. Maybe, she said. If I have another song worth sharing. He opened the door for her. The night air was cool, smelling of rain and city streets. She stepped out, cane in hand, and paused on the sidewalk. She looked up at the sky, where a few stars peeked through the light pollution. Somewhere, she liked to think he was listening, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she was carrying her grief alone. She was sharing it, and that made all the difference. The morning after the performance, she woke before sunrise. Not because of noise or discomfort, but because her mind was too full to sleep. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that used to feel heavy, like a weight pressing on her chest. But today it felt different, lighter somehow. Not because the grief was gone, it never would be, but because something had shifted inside her. She made tea the way she always did. One bag, steeped 3 minutes, a splash of milk. She carried the mug to the window and watched the sky turn from gray to pale gold. Her hands didn't shake as much as they used to. She wasn't sure if that was real or just how she felt. Later, while folding laundry, her granddaughter called. Did you see it? She asked, voice bubbling with excitement. See what? The video! Someone posted it online. It's everywhere. She didn't understand at first. What video? Your song. From last night. It's got thousands of views already. She sat down on the edge of the bed, laundry forgotten. I didn't know anyone was recording. Just a few people on their phones. But it's beautiful, Grandma. People are crying, commenting, sharing it with their parents, their friends. One woman said it helped her call her dad after 10 years of not speaking. She didn't know what to say. She'd sung for him. For herself. Not for an audience, not for strangers on the internet. The idea of it being watched over and over felt strange, almost intrusive. But then again, maybe it wasn't. Maybe the song was meant to travel. By noon, her phone started ringing. A local news station wanted an interview. A radio show asked if she'd come on air. A community theater invited her to perform at their benefit night. A grief support group reached out, asking if she'd be willing to share her story at their monthly meeting. She listened politely to each offer, thanked them kindly, and said she'd think about it. But deep down she knew her answer. That afternoon she took the bus to the cemetery. It was a short ride, one she hadn't made in months. The grounds were peaceful, shaded by old oaks, birds chirping in the branches. She walked slowly down the familiar path, Cain tapping softly on the gravel until she reached his stone. She didn't bring flowers. She brought the folded piece of paper, the original lyrics still tucked in her cardigan pocket. She sat on the bench beside his grave and smoothed the paper on her lap. I sang it, she said quietly as if he could hear. Last night, at that little cafe, people, they listened, really listened. She paused, watching a sparrow hop across the grass. I thought I'd fall apart up there, but I didn't. I felt you with me, like you always are. She stayed for nearly an hour, talking about nothing and everything, the weather, the neighbor's new dog, how the roses in her garden were finally blooming. She told him about the young woman who brought her tea, about the man who cried in the back, about how the room went so quiet she could hear her own heartbeat. Then she folded the paper again, kissed it gently, and tucked it back into her pocket. "We did it, love," she whispered. "Just like you asked." When she got home, she made a decision. She called the news station first. "Thank you for thinking of me," she said, "but I won't be doing interviews." She called the radio show, the theater, the others, each time with the same gentle refusal. Not out of pride, but out of clarity. This wasn't about fame. It never had been. But there was one request she didn't say no to. The cafe host had left a message that morning. "I know you probably don't want to do this again," he'd said, voice hesitant, "but would you consider coming back? Not to perform unless you want to, but to help start something. We've had so many messages from older folks, from caregivers, from people who lost someone. They all said your song made them feel seen. What if we made a space for that? Just once a month. Call it Memory and Music. You could lead it. Or just be there. Whatever feels right." She thought about it all evening. She walked through the house, touching the piano he'd left behind. Dusty, silent, but still beautiful. She ran her fingers over the keys, not playing, just remembering the sound. The next day, she called him back. "Yes," she said. "I'll do it." And so a new rhythm began. The first Memory and Music night was held on a quiet Tuesday evening. The cafe cleared out the usual tables and brought in comfortable chairs, arranged in a loose circle. Soft lamps replaced the bright overhead lights. There was no stage, just an open space in the center, with a single microphone on a stand and a small table with tea and cookies. She arrived early, wearing the same floral dress, though this time with matching shoes. She brought a stack of old sheet music, a few of his handwritten lyrics, and a photo of him playing piano in their living room. Only 6 people showed up that first night. 3 older women, 2 men in their 70s, and a young woman who said she was there for her mother, who couldn't come but had asked her to listen for her. No one performed right away. They just sat sipping tea, looking a little nervous. So she started. "I'm not here to teach you how to sing," she said, her voice calm and warm. "I'm here because music holds memories. And sometimes sharing those memories helps us carry them better." She played a recording of his playing Autumn Leaves, a song he'd loved. As the piano filled the room, one of the women began to cry softly. Another hummed along. The young woman closed her eyes and smiled. Then slowly people began to share. One man talked about how his wife used to sing lullabies to their children, off-key but full of love. A woman shared how she and her late husband danced in the kitchen every Friday night to old Motown records. The young woman read a letter her mother had written after her father passed, about how she still set his coffee mug out every morning, just in case. No one was judged. No one was rushed. There was no pressure to be profound or poetic. Just honesty. Just heart. By the end of the night, they'd sung 3 songs together, simple ones everyone knew. Voices shaky at first, then stronger. Harmonies imperfect but full of feeling. When it was over, no one wanted to leave. They lingered, talking, exchanging phone numbers, promising to come back next month. She didn't perform that night. She just listened. And in listening, she healed a little more. Word spread. The second month, 12 people came. The third, 20. Soon the cafe had to bring in extra chairs. People came from nearby towns. A local nursing home started bringing a small group once a month. A high school teacher brought her students who were studying grief and memory and literature. She never took center stage unless asked. Most nights she simply sat in the circle, offering a quiet word, a nod, a tissue when needed. Sometimes, if someone was too nervous to sing alone, she'd join them, her thin voice blending with theirs, giving them courage. One evening, a man in his 80s stood up, trembling. "I haven't sung in 50 years, he said. "But my wife, she loved this song." He sang Unchained Melody, voice cracking on the high notes, tears streaming down his face. When he finished, the room didn't clap. They just sat in silence, holding space for his love, his loss, his bravery. That's when she knew this was more than just a gathering. It was a sanctuary. Meanwhile, the online video of her original performance kept growing. Not in a flashy, viral way, but steadily, quietly, like roots spreading underground. Teachers used it in classrooms to talk about empathy. Hospice workers showed it to families. Therapists recommended it to clients. It wasn't about views or likes. It was about connection. She never watched it herself. She didn't need to. She'd lived it. One afternoon, a letter arrived in the mail. No return address, just a plain envelope. Inside was a handwritten note. I was in the cafe that night. I just lost my brother. I hadn't cried in months. But when you sang, I finally let go. Thank you for giving me permission to grieve. She kept that letter in her nightstand drawer next to his lyrics. She also started visiting the local senior center, not to perform, but to listen. She'd sit with residents who rarely had visitors, hold their hands, ask about their lives. Sometimes she'd hum a tune, and their eyes would light up as they remembered dances, first dates, wartime songs. She didn't see herself as special. She was just a woman who'd loved deeply and lost deeply, and found a way to keep loving through the loss. One day, her granddaughter asked, "Do you ever wish you'd done more with the attention? Gone on TV, made an album?" She smiled. Fame fades. But a moment of real connection? That lasts. I'd rather fill a small room with truth than a stadium with noise. And that was enough because in the end, what mattered wasn't how many people saw her, but how many people felt seen because of her. The cafe nights continued, month after month. Seasons changed. Leaves fell, snow came, spring returned. But every last Tuesday the circle formed again. Voices rose. Tears fell. Laughter returned. And in that small room, grief and love walked hand in hand, not as enemies, but as companions on the same long road. She never knew how many lives she touched. But she knew this. When you share your truth with kindness, it doesn't disappear. It multiplies, and that was the greatest song of all. A year had passed since that first night at the cafe, the night the audience laughed, then fell silent, then stood up crying. The place hadn't changed much. Same worn wooden floors, same chalkboard menu, same smell of coffee and cinnamon. But something deeper had shifted. You could feel it the moment you walked in. It wasn't just a cafe anymore. It was a kind of quiet harbor. A place where people came not only for coffee but for connection. She still came every last Tuesday. Not always to sing. Sometimes just to sit in the front row, hands folded in her lap, eyes soft behind her glasses, watching, listening, being present. Her cane leaned against her chair like an old friend who'd seen it all and never judged. The memory and music nights had grown, but not in a flashy way. There were no spotlights, no tickets, no social media campaigns, just word of mouth. A daughter telling her mother, a nurse mentioning it to a patient's family, a teacher bringing students who were writing about loss. People came because they needed to, not for entertainment but for healing, and she never led like a teacher. She led like someone who'd walked the path and was willing to sit with you while you found your own way. If someone stood up trembling, unsure if they could speak, she'd give them a small nod, just enough to say, "It's okay. I'm here." If someone sang off key or forgot the words, no one cared. Because this wasn't about perfection. It was about honesty. One evening, a teenager, maybe 16, wearing a hoodie and scuffed sneakers, walked in alone. He hovered near the back, arms crossed, eyes darting around like he might bolt at any second. No one pressured him. They just made space. Halfway through the night, during a quiet moment, he cleared his throat. My mom used to sing this song," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "She died last winter. Car accident." He swallowed hard. "I don't know all the words, but I'll try." He sang "You Are My Sunshine," voice cracking on the second line. Halfway through, he stopped, tears spilling over. Without a word, she stood up, walked over, and placed a hand on his shoulder. Then she started singing the next line, softly, gently, just enough to carry him through. Others joined in, not loudly, just enough to wrap him in sound. When it was over, he sat down and buried his face in his hands. No one said anything. They just let him be. Later, as people were leaving, he came up to her. "Thank you," he mumbled. "I haven't said her name out loud in months." She patted his arm. "Say it as much as you need to. She's still with you." That was the thing about these nights. They didn't fix grief. Grief isn't something you fix. It's something you learn to carry. But here, people learned they didn't have to carry it alone. Over time, the cafe became known for more than coffee. Local artists hung their work on the walls. Paintings of empty chairs, old photographs, handwritten poems about missing someone. A shelf near the door held books on loss, hope, and memory, free for anyone to take. Someone started leaving small origami birds on the tables, each one folded from a page of an old love letter or a child's drawing. No one knew who did it. It just became part of the place. She never took credit for any of it. When people thanked her, she'd just smile and say, "I didn't do this." We all did. But everyone knew where it started. With one woman, one song, and the courage to stand on a stage when no one expected her to. She still lived in the same small house, still tended her garden, though now she let the wildflowers grow where they pleased. She still talked to him sometimes, while watering the roses, while making tea, while watching the sunset from the porch swing. She didn't expect answers. She just liked to keep him in the conversation. Her granddaughter visited every Sunday, and now she brought friends. College students writing papers on community healing, volunteers from the hospice center, even a young musician who wanted to learn how to write songs that meant something. They'd sit on the porch, drink lemonade, and listen to her stories. Not the dramatic ones, but the quiet ones. How he burned toast every Sunday. How they argued over whether jazz or classical was better. How he held her hand during thunderstorms even though he claimed he wasn't scared. Those were the stories that stayed with people. Not the grand moments, but the everyday ones. The ones that prove love lives in the ordinary. One spring evening, as the cafe filled for another memory and music night, a new face appeared. An older man, maybe in his late 70s, stood near the door looking unsure. He wore a neat suit, slightly outdated, and carried a small leather notebook. He didn't sit right away. Just watched. She noticed him. After a few minutes, she walked over. "First time?" she asked gently. He nodded. "My wife. She used to come to places like this, before she got sick. She believed in the power of shared stories." He paused. "I've been alone since she passed. Didn't think I'd ever come to something like this. But today felt like the right day." "Then you're welcome here," she said. He sat down, and when it was his turn, he didn't sing. He read a short poem he'd written about laundry left in the dryer, about her perfume still lingering on a scarf, about how quiet the house is when the kettle whistles and no one else hears it. When he finished, the room was silent for a long moment. Then someone said, "Thank you." And that was enough. After the gathering, as people milled about, sharing cookies and quiet words, the cafe host came over to her. "You know," he said, "I used to think open mic night was about talent. Now I think it's about truth." She smiled. "Truth doesn't need a perfect voice. It just needs a willing heart." He nodded, looking around the room at the young man laughing with an older woman, at the teenager showing someone how to fold an origami bird, at the man who'd read the poem now sipping tea with a stranger who'd lost her husband too. This is what community is supposed to feel like. She didn't answer right away. She just watched them. All these people from different walks of life, bound together not by age or background but by something deeper, the shared human experience of loving and losing, and still choosing to show up. Later, as she prepared to leave, a little girl, maybe 8 years old, ran up to her holding a drawing. "I made this for you," she said, thrusting it forward. It showed an old woman on a stage singing, with hearts floating in the air and people crying happy tears. "Thank you," she said, touched. "It's beautiful." "My grandma says you helped her feel brave again," the girl added before running back to her mother. She tucked the drawing into her bag, next to the folded lyrics she still carried everywhere. Walking home that night, under a sky full of stars, she felt a deep peace, not because the pain was gone, but because it had found a place to belong. It wasn't a burden anymore. It was part of her story and now part of others' stories too. She never became famous, never made an album, never went on television. But in that small town, in that unassuming cafe, she became something far more important. A reminder that dignity doesn't fade with age, that grief can be honored, not hidden, that the most powerful voices are often the quietest ones, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stand up, cane in hand, heart in throat, and sing your truth to a room full of strangers. Years later, long after she was gone, the cafe still held memory and music nights. New faces came and went, new songs were sung, new tears were shed, but they always began the evening the same way, with a moment of silence, and then someone, usually a newcomer, would sing "Paper Wings." And in that song, she lived on. Not in fame, not in headlines, but in the quiet courage of others who, after hearing her story, dared to share their own. Because that's how real change happens. Not with a roar, but with a whisper. Not with a spotlight, but with a single candle passed from hand to hand, lighting the way through the dark, And every time someone new walked nervously onto that little stage, unsure if they belonged, they'd glance toward the front row, and if she was there, as she often was, they'd see her looking back. Not with judgment, not with expectation, just with steady, tear-bright eyes that said simply, "Go ahead. I'm listening." The story was never supposed to have a sixth part. 5 felt complete, like a quiet breath held and then released. But life, as it often does, kept going. And sometimes the most meaningful chapters aren't the ones we plan, but the ones that grow quietly in the spaces between. It had been 3 years since that first night at the cafe. The seasons had turned many times. Snow had fallen and melted. Flowers had bloomed and faded. People had come, shared their stories, and gone. Some to healing, some to peace, some simply to feel less alone for an evening. And through it all, she remained a steady presence, not as a star, but as a quiet anchor in a world that often felt unsteady. She was slower now. Her steps took longer. Her hands trembled more often. But her eyes, those pale blue eyes behind thin-rimmed glasses, still held the same warmth. The same deep listening that had first hushed the room all those years ago. One spring afternoon, she didn't come to the memory and music night. No one panicked at first. She'd missed a few evenings over the years. A cold, a bad knee, a day when the weight of memory felt too heavy to carry out the door. But this time felt different. The cafe host called her in the morning. No answer. He drove by her house later. Her curtains were drawn, but her garden was still tended. Roses pruned, weeds pulled, a new patch of lavender just beginning to bloom. He left a note on her door. "Thinking of you. We'll save you a seat." The next day, her granddaughter came into the cafe alone. She didn't say much. Just ordered tea, sat in the usual spot, and watched the circle form without her grandmother in it. When someone asked where she was, the granddaughter simply said, "She's resting. But she wanted me to tell you, keep singing." And so they did. That night, instead of one person leading, everyone shared a little more. A retired teacher sang a lullaby her mother used to hum. A young father read a letter he'd written to his stillborn son. An older man played a harmonica tune his brother had taught him when they were boys working on a farm. There was no grand performance, just a tapestry of small, honest moments stitched together by care. Afterward, the host found the granddaughter by the door, slipping on her coat. "Is she okay?" he asked gently. "She's tired," came the quiet reply. "Not sick. Just ready. She says she's lived a full life. Loved deeply. Been loved back. That's enough," he nodded. He understood. A week later, she returned. Not to the cafe, but to the community center where the senior choir still met every Tuesday morning. She walked in slowly, leaning on her cane, and took her usual seat in the back. No one made a fuss. They just smiled, made room, and handed her a cup of tea. When it was time to sing, she didn't join right away. But during "Somewhere Over the Rainbow," her voice rose softly, blending with the others, thin but true. And in that moment, everyone in the room felt it. This wasn't just a song. It was a gift. A farewell wrapped in melody. She never came back to the cafe's memory and music nights after that. But her presence lingered in other ways. Someone started leaving a single white rose on the stool where she used to sit. No one knew who did it. It just appeared every month, fresh and fragrant. People would touch its petals before the evening began, like a quiet blessing. Then, one quiet morning in early autumn, she passed away in her sleep, peacefully, in the same bed she'd shared with him for over 40 years. Her hands were folded over a worn copy of his lyrics. On the nightstand, a half-finished cup of tea. Outside, the garden swayed in the breeze, full of color and life. News spread quietly, not through headlines, but through whispers. The choir members gathered at the community center and sang Paper Wings together, their voices trembling but strong. The cafe closed for the evening, not out of obligation, but out of respect. On the chalkboard outside, someone wrote, "Thank you for teaching us how to listen." Her funeral was small, just as she'd wanted. No long speeches, no fancy flowers. Just family, close friends, and a few people from the cafe and the choir. Her granddaughter read the lyrics of the song, not as a performance, but as a promise. "And I'll carry you in every breath I take." Afterward, people didn't go home right away. They walked to the cafe together. The host unlocked the door, turned on the soft lamps, and put on a recording. The original one from that first night. The one that had started it all. As her voice filled the room once more, people sat in silence. Some cried. Some held hands. Some just closed their eyes and remembered. But then something unexpected happened. A young woman, the same one who'd brought her tea that first night, stood up. She walked to the center of the room, took a deep breath, and began to sing. Not the whole song. Just the first verse. Her voice was untrained, nervous, but full of love. When she finished, another person stood. Then another. One by one, they each sang a line, passing the song from voice to voice like a torch being carried forward. By the end, the whole room was singing together. Not perfectly, not loudly, but together, and in that moment it was clear she wasn't gone. She was in every note, every tear, every person who'd learned to speak their truth because she'd spoken hers first. In the weeks that followed, the memory and music nights didn't stop. They changed gently. The circle remained, but now it was led by many, not one. The retired teacher began opening each evening with a poem. The young father helped set up chairs. The teenager who'd sung "You Are My Sunshine" now brought his little sister who played the violin. The white rose still appeared on the stool every month. No one ever found out who left it. Maybe it didn't matter. Maybe it was all of them, and the song "Paper Wings" God became more than a memory. It became a tradition, not performed as a solo, but sung together as a group, near the end of every gathering. A reminder that love doesn't end. It echoes years past. New faces came. Old ones moved away or passed on. But the spirit of those evenings remained. The cafe changed owners once, but the new owner had attended a memory and music night as a college student, and insisted the tradition continue. Even the chalkboard still had a small corner reserved for handwritten notes from guests. For Mom. Miss you. Dad. Still dancing in the kitchen. One evening, a little girl, maybe 6 or 7, stood up during the open sharing time. She held a crumpled piece of paper in her hand. My grandpa died, she said, voice small but clear. He used to sing to me when I couldn't sleep. I wrote him a song. She sang 3 lines about stars and bedtime and warm blankets. Her voice wobbled. She forgot the last word, but no one cared. When she sat down, the entire room gave her the same quiet nod, the one she'd once given to so many others. And in the front row, an older woman with silver hair and kind eyes smiled through her tears, because the circle hadn't closed. It had grown. Her story hadn't ended that night on stage. It had just begun. In the courage of a teenager, the poem of a widow, the violin of a child, the shared silence of strangers who became friends. She never sought to change the world. She only wanted to honor one man's love, but in doing so, she reminded everyone that the smallest acts of honesty can ripple farther than we ever imagine. Today, if you walk into that cafe on the last Tuesday of the month, you'll still find the circle. You'll hear laughter and tears, off-key singing and shaky voices, stories of loss and love that span generations. You might see the white rose on the stool. You might hear Paper Wings sung by a dozen voices at once, and if you listen closely, beneath it all you'll hear something else. The quiet sound of a promise kept, not with fame, not with fanfare, but with a song, a seat, and the simple, powerful act of showing up, exactly as you are. Because in the end, that's all any of us really need, to be seen, to be heard, and to know that even in our broken places, we are still worthy of love, and that more than anything, is the legacy she left behind. Not in stone or song alone, but in the hearts of everyone who learned, because of her, how to sing their own truth.